Hello, everyone. It's fantastic to see everyone here in such a packed venue, and also here it's fully packed online as well in terms of attendance. So great to see you all. So welcome to this, which is a number of things. Firstly, it's the second of our respectfully disagreed debates. We had a fantastic one on degrowth or green growth last term. So this is a follow-up to that on this topic. But also it's part of an almost weekly series of events that we have under the Biodiversity Network and the Levi Hume Centre for Nature Recovery. And before launching it today, I just mentioned we have a second event today at 4:30, which is Bob Costanza again, talking about his new book on overcoming societal addiction to growth. And that's in the Geography Lecture Theatre. And also online as well. And so I don't know where we are in terms of sellouts or their sellout there, but if you can't get in, I think there's a few spaces there in person still. So if you want to still go to that, otherwise you can also join that online. And then I just mentioned we have a few more. Next week we have Charlie Burrell talking about rewilding based on net rewilding, and a few more. We have a number of events after that as well. Sandra Diaz talking about the International Biodiversity Convention in a few weeks' time as well. So without any further ado, over to the debate, and to our chair, Kate Raworth, the renegade economist, author of Donut Economics, who will chair this and introduce the two speakers. So over to you, Kate.
Thank you, Yadvinda, and welcome everybody. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and from the packed room in the house and the packed Zoom call online. Hello, Zoom. It's full on Zoom as well, which means a lot of people want to have this conversation, which is a good thing. So I'm really delighted to be here today because I'm joined by two brilliant, thoughtful experts in their field who also happen to be great friends of mine. So this is a lovely position to be in. Let me introduce first Bob Costanza, who is Professor of Ecological Economics, currently at the Institute of Global Prosperity at University College London. Bob was the co-founder of the International Society for Ecological Economics and the founder of the journal Ecological Economics. You can hear Ecological Economics, right? You get that? Mm-hmm. And the first president. And author of many, many papers and books. And then Erik Gomez-Baggethun, who is Professor of Environmental Science at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences and the President-elect of the International Society for Ecological Economics. You get it, right? You get it. And author of many, many fantastic papers. So I want to just celebrate the first thing that both Bob and Erik are ecological economists. And if pushed to put a name on myself other than renegade, I would say I'm an ecological economist. So I'm just going to celebrate and note that it's quite rare to have three ecological economists sitting on a stage here in Oxford. Can we have a round of applause for that, please? Because before we go into respectfully disagreeing, it's really important just to recognize that we hugely agree on a lot of things. And Herman Daly, founding father of ecological economics, is, I hope, smiling down on us right now, because everyone on this stage profoundly agrees that any economic analysis starts by recognizing the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the living world and has to get with it and has to realize that and has to be in service to life and compatible with conditions for life. So we have that in common. And if anybody came along and challenged that, we three would be immediately mobilized as a team, right? So we have so much in common. And in that space, we can now lean into where we may disagree and do it respectfully and thoughtfully. And in a university, it's the best place to do it. And if you think you already have a view, an opinion on monetary valuation and whether you're really for it or really against it, live that certainty now. Because where else but in a university? Because once we're out in the world of employment, if you're working for an institute or a government, you're probably going to find yourself on one side or the other of that position where there's far less room for disagreeing. It might be in your job title or in your job description or on the labels of the reports you write. So now is a beautiful time to open your mind. And as the performance poet Taylor Marley once said, changing your mind is one of the best ways of finding out whether or not you've still got one. So we invite everybody to do that today. So I don't work every day on this debate, on this topic, right? We've got it here. The monetary valuation of nature. Is it a pragmatic approach to conservation of the living world, or is it dangerous and unhelpfully moving towards commodification? I don't work on this every day, and I'm sitting flanked by two people who have thought probably harder about it than most people I know in the world. And I'm guessing that most of you, although you care greatly about it, you don't work on it every day either. So I want to make sure that all of us can follow this debate. So I'm going to kick off with the best way that I know to explain it to myself. And I've got some little objects here that we're going to use throughout, but they're all, don't worry, they're all going to pop up on the screen right now. So let's see if this works. Click. Okay. We are here bound together by a care for the living world. Yeah, I have her in. Here we are, little blue marble. Okay. That's what brings everyone into this room. A care for life on the only known living planet in the universe, and for the genius of life to reproduce conditions conducive to life. That we definitely have in common. Now, there's a question that if we care for that, should we then aim to identify ecosystem functions? So I could think of nothing better than a pair of binoculars. Food production, soil formation, climate regulation, right? Naming, as humans starting to name these incredible functions of the living world that generate the conditions conducive to life. So identifying and naming ecosystem functioning. Now then there's a next step. Should we, there's a lot of things with my hands here. Should we quantify, right? Little ruler. My daughter lent me her pencil case ruler, little orange ruler. Should we measure these? Because we do, we can measure the sequestration of carbon. We can measure energy and material flows in a pond system, in a forest system. We can measure the metabolism of systems. That's the next step, putting metrics on it. In parts per million of carbon dioxide, or in carbon sequestered, or the flow of life. Then the next step from there is to say, okay, let's pick out something happening with the screen. Let's pick out and identify those ecosystem functions that actually serve humanity. So I've got a little person here. Which ones actually benefit us humans? The stability of a climate, the purification of air, the purification of water, the formation of soil on which we depend, the beauty of a forest when we walk through it. So that's the identifying of ecosystem services in respect of their relationship and their benefits for humanity. Let's find out as we discuss whether they both agree this far along the spectrum. And next step says, well, if we're going to identify those, can we quantify them? And can we quantify them, give value to them? And so I brought a calculator because I want to be able to add them up in commensurate terms. And of course, the most typical, common, widely used way of adding things up in commensurate terms is putting a monetary valuation on them. So can we add them up and create a value, give a monetary value to ecosystem services or to natural capital on which we know we depend? Now, along the line here, I'm going to pretend for a moment to be a government, right? I have my national accounts. This is my profit and loss ledger. Let's say I'm a national government. Suddenly, those monetary values could come into my national accounts. And there's a pretty strong motivation for doing it. Suddenly they can actually appear on the pages of my book, and therefore in the conversations in my ministry. We can take them into account in our decisions. Is that what's going to happen? And is that your motivation for supporting them? Or are you concerned that actually something else might happen? That once the value of ecosystem services is identified, the value created by this river or by this forest, that there's a risk that property rights get assigned. Who actually owns that forest? Who owns the rights to that river? Who has the property of which those system values flow? And if those property rights are assigned, is there a risk that suddenly, we know property rights are a foundation for markets. So we suddenly find ourselves with ecosystem market valuations, payments for ecosystem services or ecosystems for sale. And is this not a slippery slope towards the commodification of nature. We've put a price tag on nature, we've commodified it and made it a market commodity, just like so many other things that are on sale in the street. Now, that's a quick run through the spectrum. And I invite you to ask yourself, how far along that do you go? Where do you feel comfortable up to? Where do you think things can be cut or inevitably run forward? Because that's what I think we're going to hear Bob and Erik setting it out in their own way, and we'll tap back into this if it's useful for us in the room. But I invite each of you to pick up these objects if you want to, or to bring others, or to speak to others. Let's see how this goes. So Bob, would you like to kick us off? Do you want, and there's a
Yes.
Oh,
I'll do
right,
a
we
slide.
can do it. Okay, I'm going to move. Do you want to do it from here, or do you want to stand there? What would you
Whatever works best. I can do it from here, I guess.
Okay, so I'm going to move some. Sure, you happy there? Can everybody see?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me with this? Yeah. Hi, everyone. And thank you, Kate, for that very explicit and very good explanation of ecosystem services. And I think some of the issues there. My background is actually in systems ecology. So I started out thinking and studying about the whole system. And my PhD program, they had a foreign language requirement. And I convinced them that I could take economics instead of a foreign language. So I took economics as a foreign language during my PhD. So I got enough of it, I think, to get inoculated, but not quite enough to get the disease. So, and ever since then, and I think ecological economics is really all about just that. How do you look at the whole system? And how do we use that knowledge to create a better world? A more sustainable, a more desirable world, a fairer world, et cetera. I think that's what we're all talking about. So all of these things are tools, or should be tools to that end. And if they're not, I think we should consider, modifying them. Let's see. I do have some slides. So yeah. Oh, I just clicked on.
Everybody cross your fingers, and this is going to work. Just click forward.
Is it this one?
Oh yeah, I forgot that bit.
Yeah. And we'll see what we disagree on. I think we're going to agree up until the keys there, because I think that's really what the issue is. It's about property rights. It's about protecting the commons. It's about recognizing that ecosystems and ecosystem services are common goods. They don't fit into the market model, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't value them and make that value more explicit. So that's what I'll talk about. And I'll start with this. As you probably have seen or heard about this paper that we published back in 1997, which was an early attempt to try to quantify in monetary units the value of, we had 17 different ecosystem services that we identified across 16 different biomes. We basically came together with a box of about 200 research papers that we then synthesized and came out with our estimate. And by our own, if you read the paper, the largest section is the section about caveats and limitations of this sort of study. But we thought all of those caveats only meant that this was a conservative estimate, and still it was much larger than global GDP at the time. We did manage to get the cover of the magazine, which was great, but we didn't get to say what they put on the cover. And they said pricing the planet. And I think that's part of the issue, that it's not really about pricing. It's really about valuing in a more comprehensive way. How do these services contribute to well-being? And they're not exchanged in markets, and they shouldn't be exchanged in markets. They're non-marketed, extra-marketed, or common property resources. And I think that's been part of the confusion, because if you quantify these things in some common units, and dollars seem to be the one that most people can understand, and that can be added up, then some people are led immediately to this idea that these are okay.
Maybe slides online, so keep on talking about. I'll have to just exit the slideshow.
Okay. Anyway, so this paper got a lot of attention, both positive and negative. Martha described it as meaningless. So, but I think it's had a lot of citations. So I think it kicked off a lot of research and further investigation, which is what we really wanted to do in the first place. We weren't saying this is the This is the value. Okay, why is this not working?
While we're waiting for the slide, why don't you say a little bit about what motivated you to write that piece in 1997?
We had a workshop. I was a Pew Fellow, along with Gretchen Daly and several others, and we had a workshop on this topic. And a book came out of that that Gretchen was the editor of, and I had a couple chapters in. But during that workshop, we were saying, well, we're identifying all these different ecosystem services, you know, and how they function, how the system functions. Why don't we try to add it all up, and what's it all worth? And how do we make that apparent, you know, to the larger community that this is a big deal, you know? Because I think in the economics community at the time, at least, you know, there were externalities, and the externalities were these tiny little things, you know, we can deal with them maybe, but we shouldn't worry about it too much, you know, and if we got richer, we can deal with all the externalities. And our point was, no, the externalities are the big part of the system, and it's really the economy that's the smaller part.
So was that coming out of concerns of what was happening in policymakers? You're saying externalities seem to be minor, peripheral, and were you seeing a lack of attention to the living world in policymaking that
motivated? You know, nature was not being valued, and therefore it was considered to be not worth anything. You know, so any policies that damage natural systems at the expense of the economy, you know, those damages were ignored to the extent that they could be. So, how are we doing here? I don't want to take more than my 10 minutes. This could go on forever.
Sorry, the online viewers couldn't see the power.
Is it okay now?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much.
Well,
thank you.
And yeah, there we go. So since then, there's been a lot of interest, as I said, in this whole issue of ecosystem services from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment back in 2005. The IPBEST has is currently releasing a lot of research. But you know, the definition here, if you don't know about what are ecosystem services, they contribute to a whole range of different aspects of human well-being. So it's not just about timber and fish, you know, it's about this whole range of services that, you know, include, and the way they categorize them were provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting services. But there's a whole range of things. And like I said, as a systems ecologist, we understand that these systems are complex. And it's very difficult to really see, you know, yeah, it's very difficult to see all of the ways that these ecosystems interact with human well-being. Plus, I think this diagram misses the interaction that's required with the other forms of capital assets. That in fact, we're talking about, you know, a system that consists of both, you know, built capital, conventional built capital, human capital, individual people as individuals, social capital, all of the interactions and networks among people, you know, their cultures, their governments, etc., and natural capital, everything else that we didn't have to produce.
Sorry.
And that those four types of assets need to interact in very complex ways to produce sustainable human well-being. And ecosystem services then are the relative contribution, you know, in these complex situations of natural capital to this sustainable well-being. How do you measure that? How do you quantify that?
Keep going, Bob. You're doing great.
Keep going.
If you want to use any of these. Sorry.
This would never happen at UCL, would it?
It's rocking on. Don't worry, this is not your time.
No, that's okay. I'm just trying to remember what I was going to go to next. Anyway, let's see if that happens. Yeah, no. Should I stand up there? Does that help? No. Take it to the next one. Yeah. Anyway, how do you quantify it then? How do we get to the next stage in Kate's series here? You know, how do you quantify these ecosystem services, the contribution to sustainable well-being? Well, you can't do that from the point of view of just ecology or just economics or just psychology or any individual discipline. I think you need to look at the whole system, as we were saying, and how those different parts of the system interact. And also the sustainability part, which is how do they interact over time, over the long term, not just in the short term. Are we done? We're not trying anymore. Oh, there we go. Okay. This is an important one because it gets at the quote unquote debate. And we talked about this at the beginning. I don't think we really want to have debate on this issue. I think we want to have a dialogue, a discussion. You know, we're not trying to say there's one right or one wrong way of looking at it. We're saying that this is a more nuanced, you know, conversation that we need to have, because I do think we share the goals that Kate talked about. But there are some mistaken identities, I think, that drive this perception that there's an argument. And one is that, you know, economics is equal to the market. Economics is not the market. Market is one institution within the framework, you know, of production and consumption and markets. And it can be a valuable one, but it does not and cannot apply to everything because marketed goods and services really have to have certain characteristics in order to fit into that sort of framework. You know, have to be rival and excludable. And if they're not, and you try to force them into that model, it really doesn't work very effectively. So we need different ways and different kinds of property rights, really, to deal with things like ecosystem services. But I still think we need to value those services and their contribution in that context of, you know, the different types of capital and how they interact over time. And that is not the same thing as privatizing or commodifying or trading those services. I think that's the next step, which you don't necessarily and you shouldn't have to take. Although some people seem to think that is the next logical step. It is not, and it shouldn't be, and it can't be really. It just doesn't fit. So expressing these values in monetary units is not the same as market or exchange values. So when you say monetary valuation, that kind of implies to people that you're talking about exchange values. And in fact, in the new accounting framework, you know, the UN's system of environmental and economic accounts, they limit the values that they're looking at to exchange values rather than this broader set of values that we're talking about. So they're only picking up a fraction of all of the things that, it's not that those exchange values don't occur. Some things do get into the market and affect GDP. Some of the services, particularly the provisioning services, but the big ones don't. So I think those are some of the key issues there. And the other point is, you can't really avoid valuation. You can't just say, oh, we're not going to value these systems. It's just not the right thing to do. It's not ethical, you know, et cetera. Because every time you make a decision about ecosystems and their services, you're implicitly valuing them. You're saying, well, we're going to do one thing versus the other. That implies that the thing we're doing is more valuable than the thing we're not doing. So I think all we're talking about is how do we make those values more explicit so we can make better decisions and bring them to the front. There's a whole range of uses for these valuations, you know, from just raising awareness. I think that's what our original 1997 paper did. You can use them to modify national income and well-being accounts. And I differentiate there between income and well-being because the SIA accounts and most of the others are just measuring income. They're not measuring well-being or welfare. And so I think that's what we need to get to, is how do you incorporate the whole spectrum. You can use them to, you know, analyze different policies for land use planning. This idea of payment for ecosystem services, maybe we'll get into that a little bit more because I don't think that actually functions as a market. That most of the ones that work are really government, you know, programs that use economic incentives to get the kind of behavior that we want, which I think is fine. And knowing the value of those services is really important in that process. But trying to shoehorn that into, you know, a market model doesn't seem to work. You know, even carbon markets, but we can talk about that. And then full cost accounting, we know that the market is not telling us the truth about anything that we're buying these days. It's leaving out the damages to ecosystem services and all the costs that involves. So how do we actually get there? I should go more quickly, right? And common asset trust, I think that's a better way to handle the property rights issue than trying to market ecosystem services. We do need new economic models, and this is ecological economics. So we've talked about that already. You know, we need to worry about the size of the economy. We need to worry about distribution and fairness. We need to worry about economic efficiency. We can talk more about that in the discussion. But also, I think we need a much broader approach to how we value these things, because most of the work that's been done has been focused on this idea of efficiency and, you know, current willingness to pay of individuals, you know, who don't have perfect information. So there's lots of problems with this, and it's really limited because it doesn't consider fairness. It doesn't consider sustainability. And to get at those issues, we need to have different approaches to valuation, like you know, community valuation or deliberation in larger communities, and some modeling that can look further into the future to see what actually is sustainable or could be sustainable. I think this is my last one. And like I said, it's complicated. And it's much more complicated than this diagram shows. So it's not a simple linear progression down like this. There are feedback loops. There's lots of things going on in these complex systems. And so being able to understand and model these systems, I think, is where we ultimately need to get to in order to have a better handle on ecosystem services and social services, and, you know, how they interact with our conventional production and consumption, and how we can use all of that to create a better world for everyone, for humans and the rest of nature. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Fantastic, Bob. Thank you so much, and bravo for keeping going despite the technological difficulties. Okay, we will go straight to Erik, I think, actually, just to keep the debate moving. And I'm just going to note that Bob said you think your positions may diverge when it went from giving a monetary-based valuation to the property rights to the keys. So let's see. I'm going to come over here now. Let's see where Erik takes this. Over to you.
Maybe I should come down with you.
Yeah, sure.
So the discussion we're having here today, let me put it a little bit in context. In the last couple of decades, we've seen an emergence of what some people have referred to as the new environmental pragmatism. The basic idea here is that we would have failed to reverse the climate and the biodiversity crisis with traditional approaches to conservation, the ones that emphasize intrinsic values of nature and that makes a case for protecting nature for nature's sake. So a growing number of environmentalists and economists have made the case that we have to turn pragmatic. We live in a capitalist society. We have to harness the language, the values, and the instruments that are powerful in decision-making process. So many environmental scientists and economists now advocate the use of economic valuation as a pragmatic short-term strategy. Thank you. To communicate the value of ecosystems and biodiversity in a language that reflects dominant political and economic views. And this is the idea that we can express ecosystem services in money terms is a relatively novel idea. It's something that was not really conceived before the establishment of classical economics. If we review what the classical economists have to say about ecosystem services, they did not use the word, or they think about it, they thought about them avant la lettre. And they acknowledged the existence, but they always thought they had to be understood as values in use, not as values in exchange, not as monetary values we can exchange in markets, right? Marx was very explicit about this, but we also find it in the big liberal economists. So David Ricardo, for instance, wrote, natural agents are serviceable to us by adding to value use, but as they perform, they work gratuitously, as nothing is prepaid for the use of the air, the heat, and the water. The assistance which they afford us have nothing to value in exchange. As Jean-Baptiste said, early 19th century, the wind which turns our mill and even the heat of the sun work for us, but happily, no one has yet been able to say, the wind and the sun are mine, and the service which they render must be paid for. the discussion we're having today is where do we believe is the reasonable limit to the use of money and markets in environmental governance. And the issue of commodification has been criticized at least on three main grounds. First one, because of the way it can drive inequalities. In a world in which more things and more things can be bought and sold, those who have less struggle more to make a living. The more we commodify social and environmental domains, the more we push the inequalities between possessors and dispossessed. The second one is the extent to which money metrics can capture in a meaningful way the multiple ways through which people attribute meaning and importance to nature. Nature holds symbolic values, cultural values, ecological values. Can we capture spiritual values? Can we capture all of them in a meaningful way through monetary metrics? A third element of the discussion is that we know that when we start using economic incentives, sometimes they can work nicely. We can reinforce motivations for conservation, but sometimes they can backfire. And external payments for conservation can sometimes crowd out the morals, the intrinsic motivations to protect nature. So ultimately, the discussion we're having today is, I believe, the core of the discussion, to which extent we can detach monetary valuation or expression of nature in monetary terms from commodification of nature. And I think this dilemma is very nicely captured in an exchange in Nature some time ago between Douglas Macaulay and Bob Costanza, where basically Macaulay makes a case that the time is ripe for returning to the protection of nature for nature's sake, so mobilizing the idea of intrinsic values of nature. Whereas Bob Costanza makes the case that we can actually express nature in monetary terms without necessarily commodifying, right? So Bob notes, valuing ecosystem services in monetary terms is different from commodifying them for trade in private markets. And yes, it's true that there is much mixture, blending in the literature among concepts and ideas that are interrelated but not equivalent. Privatization, monetization, valuation, commodification, financialization. We see sometimes loose use of this language. And it is true that valuation does not necessarily lead to commodification. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition. So far so good. I think Bob and myself tend to agree on that. Where maybe our paths diverge is whether we can effectively detach economic valuation from commodification when we see this process operating in a concrete institutional, ideological, and political context. To be quite concrete, the context of neoliberal capitalism. A few definitions. I don't want to bore you with details, but if we look at the main authorities of language, the definitions of money, the ideas that come out: a commodity accepted as a medium of economic exchange, the medium in which prices and values are expressed as currency, it circulates to facilitate trade. A medium of exchange, says Oxford English Dictionary, the assets, property, and resources owned by someone. An item accepted as payment for goods and services, the primary functions are serving as a medium of exchange, as among other things. Monetary value, the amount that would be paid in cash for an asset or service if it were to be sold. So I follow the argument that we may express nature in monetary terms without making a case for commodification, exchange, and so on. The problem I see is that I believe we're walking here a very fine line. If we are trying to elaborate a discourse that rests on ideas that do not resonate or at least broadly with established knowledge in common wisdom or in the authorities of language, I think we are doomed to face a lot of misunderstanding in the message we are sending. And I think this can be highly problematic. And I think one of the keys of the discussion is that sometimes we tend to think of commodification as an almost discrete process. The moment we set up a market, we make a sort of new institutional arrangement so that we can buy and sell something that previously was not meant for sale. But importantly, and crucially for the discussion we're having today, commodification is not a discrete event, it's a process that involves, yes, institutional changes, setting up markets, but it also involves previous phases, including symbolic, discursive, and institutional changes through which a good or service that previously was not meant for sale enters the sphere of money and market exchange. It's sometimes criticized on the ground that some things ought not to be for sale, neither governed through market norms and values. And there is historical evidence that commodification changes the values governing the relations between people and nature, as these adopt the form and logic of utility and market transactions. So which are the main stages in the commodification of nature? And here I go a little bit back to the objects that Kate presented in the beginning. I would say there are four main ones. The first one takes place at the conceptual level. It's about framing. It's when we frame nature in anthropocentric and utilitarian ways. When we start looking nature through the lens of ideas like capital, stocks, assets, services, ideas that mobilize utilitarian and anthropocentric notions of human-nature relationships. The second stage is monetization, expressing nature in monetary units. And then we move into the institutional changes. If we want to set up markets, we need clearly defined property rights. Coase, Hardin, and others have been explicit about this and very influential in driving certain political agendas. So the establishment of clear property rights, very often private property rights. And then the very final stage would be the sale and trade of ecosystem functions, services, and so on, through wetland banking, carbon trading, biodiversity offsetting, and other related mechanisms. And it's not by chance that I have avoided setting here payments for ecosystem services, because I agree with Bob that when you despite the market mythology around payments for ecosystem services, when you see how they work in practice, they work mostly as green rural subsidies run by public authorities. So that's an important clarification as well. So basically, I think Bob and myself tend, to agree that this is not the way to go. Maybe if we had some kind of unabashed market conservationists, we would have more action here today. But basically, Bob and I maybe are more sort of the discussion on to which extent we should go for these two ones, right? And to which extent we can detach these two ones from the previous one. I think Bob makes the case that we should stop here. I've made a case in the past that we should stop here. And in the last few years, I'm taking a step back and I'm making the case that maybe we should stop here. And I will explain why. Concepts like natural capital and ecosystem services are not neutral. They set human-nature relationships into one of utility and exchange, thereby expanding the economic rationality and the profit calculus into ecosystems and biodiversity. Monetary valuation methods are value-articulating institutions. They frame choices within a narrative of scarcity, efficiency, and profit, often serving as discursive framing and metrical technology that paves the way for commodification. Importantly, valuation is not used in an ideological and institutional void. And this is somewhere where ecological economists maybe need to put more attention to political economy and political ecology. Sometimes we're too focused on our methodologies, our normative claims, and we fail a little bit to understand which are the socio-political processes within which we're operating. First of all, we need to pay attention to the big picture, the major political frame, and to the inherent drive of capitalism to expand markets and create new outlets for accumulation by creating new commodities. More specifically, we should pay attention to the specific stage of capitalism, which we're at the moment, or that maybe we're moving to an end of that stage, but at least so-called neoliberalism has been a sort of aggressive push towards more commodification. And we have to think that, yes, in theory, we may say we mobilize this kind of metaphors, we use monetary metrics, and then we stop the process there. The problem is that others will take that metrical technology, others will take those discursive framings and will keep furthering commodification agendas, sometimes against the will of those that are mobilizing these tools. At the time where this most influential paper on valuation was being released, we had in the US Republican-dominated Congress, we were witnessing a frontal neoliberal attack against environmental regulations. And the Clinton Advisory Board on Sustainable Development was producing a consensus document making the case for deregulating environmental regulations and replacing them for market-based instruments. Can we really make the case that we can mobilize this type of metrical technology without feeding into these socio-political processes? I think it's extremely difficult to detach them from one another. So efforts to increase nature's value, to express nature's values in monetary terms, in the name of pragmatism, may have served, I'm afraid, often against the will of its promoters, a market conservationist agenda driving commodification of nature. This is, I believe, the tragedy of well-intentioned valuation. But getting a step back, I would like to say a few words about the power of metaphors. When I put this picture, I thought it looked like Kate. So we shouldn't underestimate the power of metaphors, right? Metaphors determine the way we name the environment. It also determines how we perceive it and how we interact with it. It shapes how we attribute meaning and importance and how we emphasize, relegate, or neglect certain types of values. It determines or mobilizes what we see and what we don't see. They attribute symbolic meaning, which can be a powerful determinant of attitudes and behavior. And a shift of metaphor is not simply a shift in jargon in language. It's also a shift in the way we understand and give sense, represent the world, and communicate the world. So it's important that epistemic communities adopting certain metaphors are aware of the implications this has not only conceptually, but also in terms of the moral and the political stance embodied in such choices, often without us being entirely aware about that. I believe that the natural capital framework reflects a worldview ultimately anchored in some of the core foundations of capitalist Western culture underlying our truncated relation with non-human nature. Importantly, this includes a human's nature dualism. We keep thinking of nature as separate from humans. Nature is there to serve us through ecosystem service, unidirectional kind of framing, not a sort of reciprocity based of framing. What do we give back to nature is not entirely clear in this type of framing. This separation it has deep consequences, I believe, among others, because we take out agency from non-human entities. This impedes or put obstacles on our ability to develop empathy towards nature, which is maybe one of the reasons why culturally we accept many of the atrocities we are doing against non-human world. The second one is anthropocentrism. I'm finishing, Kate. The idea that not only humans are different from nature, but we are superior to nature, which is what justifies the idea that we can exclude non-humans from the community of justice. And finally, utilitarianism. The idea that we should primarily mobilize arguments around the usefulness of nature. This philosophy, moral philosophy, underpins self-interest calculus as the ultimate driver and frames human-nature relationships in terms of cost benefits. Last slide. Is it time to leave utilitarian environmentalism behind? Maybe it is. I will propose here 4 lines of thinking and action, which would be sort of the propositive side of my case. First is a discursive shift towards decommodification, right? Not only being in the defensive way of, stopping valuation and commodification, but actually take a more offensive stance and start to think how we can decommodify the environment where markets have gone too far. Putting this at the center stage of the sustainability agenda and strengthening right-based approaches. United Nations Harmony with Nature initiative is an important move in this direction. A departure from prevailing ontological conception, moral framing, and legal coding of human-nature relationships, and a shift from a morality of utility to a morality of care. Reallocation of property rights, restricting the scale and scope of rights to privately own and destroy non-human life. And finally, the extension of the community of justice to non-human entities, including rights of nature, environmental personhood, and guardianship, based on principles of sustainability, responsibility, reciprocity, and interconnectedness. Thank you.
Thank you, Erik. Thank you, Bob. Two very compelling and impassioned presentations of views that begin connected and then diverge. And that's why we're here. So.
Can I respond to Erik?
In a minute,
Okay.
Of course. So what I'm going to bring you back to these objects here. And Bob said maybe we diverge between the quantifying value and assigning property rights. And then Erik very clearly with your slide said, actually, I used to think it was not okay to assign monetary value, but it was okay to name and recognize ecosystem services. But I even want to come further back from that. And I'm moving away from that, right? So you're moving back almost into my realm of I'll identify ecosystem functioning, and we can measure it in nature's own metrics. But therein we stop and we go in a different direction. And you ended up saying rights of nature and other approaches to protecting the living world. Okay. I think you make a very compelling case. And so I'm going to sit like this a little bit for a moment, take this side, right? I'm going to be a government minister, and I'm here with my account book, and I'm either looking at ancient woodland in the UK that's going to probably get cut down for high-speed rail, or I'm looking at the coast of Zanzibar where we might build a new tourist hotel. Now, those might not be showing up in my accounts of how I'm valuing the high-speed rail or tourism. So I see Bob's argument as putting it on the page, and I, as an economist trained in the economics department, and that's what grabs my attention, and it needs to land on my page. And if not that way, I think the question is then how, and I'm not going to ask you to respond this moment, but I think there's a lot of onus on, if we're not going to use this tool, then what? Because we know these times are urgent, and we know we need to speak. We want to use the right framing, but we need to speak to the language of power, or we need to change what power is doing, because power is deciding whether or not forests are cut down and whether or not the coast is transformed. So then what? What is a credible alternative way of doing this? And a question I'm going to bring to you, Bob, would be, it was really interesting seeing the cover of Nature in 1997. And as you said, oh, annoying that they wrote pricing the planet rather than valuing it. And isn't that a symbolic early warning that, I think as Erik is arguing, people can't help but see a monetary sign as a for sale sign and a price. And we haven't got enough ability to distinguish between what's a valuation and a price. And so we slip very quickly down to the other end of this spectrum. Can we kick off and you respond to that? You know, that early sign, and as you said, it's frustrating that they did that, but is there not a risk of the metaphors that we hold in our relation to markets and exchange and value, that it's inevitably going to slip in that direction?
No, not inevitably, but I think there is that misperception, like you say, especially if you talk about pricing and markets. And I think it's, you know, the natural capital framework, I think is not the neoliberal framework. It's not trying to put everything into markets. In fact, it's saying, no, many of these services are public goods. Public goods are not well handled, you know, by market exchanges. You need different kinds of institutions. And I think that's what, if you really get into it, you start thinking about what ecosystems are and how they produce their services, you'll recognize that markets are just not going to be an effective way to manage them. So this idea of common asset trusts, or, you go back to the work of Eleanor Ostrom, how do you build, a community that can manage these assets and recognize the value of the assets and recognize that those assets have to be protected from not just anyone can use them. Otherwise, they're open access. Then you get the actual tragedy of the commons. So you have to build property rights around them. But I think the challenge is, how do you build community property rights? And it's certainly possible to do that. And that valuing these assets can be quite an effective tool in helping to do that. The other point I would make is that these are not mutually exclusive, sort of points of view. If you want to protect natural systems for their own sake, or do you want to protect them because we recognize that they contribute to our well-being and the well-being of the rest of nature at the same time? Those are just those are additive things. They're not or things.
And can you,
So,
you gave us a really great table of many different uses of monetary valuation.
Yeah.
Is there a particular project or a program or a country or a policy that you could name? It doesn't have to be the best in the world, but just a specific example where you say, look, it was actually used not to turn it into a market and make a commodification, but actually change a calculation that was made. It changed what happened in the world.
Costa Rica is a good example, and their payment for ecosystem services system, which is one of the oldest ones. And it doesn't really have any market components at all. I mean, they collect funds from various sources like the gasoline tax and other sources, and they have a government agency that says, okay, we want to restore these forests in Costa Rica. They've deforested the whole country, and by paying farmers, a bit more than they could make, running cattle on their land to reforest it, they managed to reforest the entire country. Effectively. And now they're considering expanding that system. And I've been working with some people there to think of it, the whole country, as a common asset, that needs to be managed in the same way. But also considering and trying to measure the value of these ecosystem services. So I don't think that valuation and this whole spectrum, is anything necessarily connected to the neoliberal market mechanism. In fact, I think it's the furthest away you can possibly get. And it does recognize that people are interconnected with the rest of nature. It's not anthropomorphism. It's not ecocentric. It's not centric at all. It's recognizing that this is a complex system, that, all of the parts are interdependent and they have positive and negative feedback loops. And so you have to recognize that. So the whole idea that, we're only doing this because it serves individual people is I think a misperception of the whole concept. You have to have healthy ecosystems to have a healthy society. And that means that we have to protect and conserve healthy ecosystems, for our own sake, but for the sake of the rest of the system as well. So how do you think of it as a whole system rather than just people? And it is true that the sort of neoliberal model ignores all of that, and that's what we're trying to argue against.
Okay, thank you. And actually, Erik, I'm going to come. So sitting with the example that's given of Costa Rica, and without us descending into the specifics of whether or not it was this in Costa Rica, but one example of paying farmers to reforest land rather than graze cattle has, in a country that we know has reforested. That's one example that's given. You had a quote from Jean-Baptiste Say saying something like, thankfully, no one has managed yet to say the sun and the wind, those are mine. But what if we used that same argument and said, well, no one has managed to say the forest is mine or ours, so, well, I'm just going to cut it because I can actually make more value. So when we flip that around, don't we want to be able to make claim to protecting something in common, right? So the sun and the wind are out there and benefiting us, but what if it's actually here that something people can? I mean, I think Jean-Baptiste Say used something that was easily external and global, but what if it's the forest that we want to prevent somebody from cutting and say, it's not yours to cut, it's actually of huge value to all. And with this, I want to ask you, what do you, and I just want to acknowledge, it's very easy for us to get really kind of like into debate here, right? Let's see if we can just resist doing that. I want to ask you, what do you most appreciate about Bob's argument? I'm going to ask you the same in a minute.
What I appreciate most of Bob's argument, which has been a great inspiration for my own work, not least during my PhD and so on. It's basically the idea of nature as the material foundation of life, which I think is something that has become very abstract in dominant, in mainstream economics approaches. No, so this idea that we need some kind of frameworks and tools to make visible human dependence and economic dependence on functioning ecosystems, I think it's fundamentally important. And I think it's even more important in an urban technological era where a larger and larger share of the population is increasingly both physically and cognitively detached from ecosystem dynamics. And we have lost the capacity to understand the very fundamental ways in which humans and the economy depends on nature. So as one of the leading ecological economists, for me, the work that Bob has done in that sense is invaluable.
And you're saying that we need to move away from utilitarian language, and I really appreciated the metaphors. And actually, I do think the inside of my head sometimes looks a bit like that. I like that. But the metaphors and the language, and we know Hannah Arendt once said, a stray dog has a far greater chance of surviving if it's given a name. But it really makes a difference what name we give, if we call the dog Scamp or if we call the dog Champ, right? You're thinking of a different dog. So whether we give the name, the living world, Gaia, the rights of nature, or we give the name ecosystem services, natural capital, these names change. And I'm hearing you're saying this is a very important distinction that you are leaning more into in your own work.
Yes, I think the type of values we mobilize through frames and through concept is critically important. And I think, and I've read carefully much of Bob's work, and I think we agree with this idea that, I mean, even beyond all these moral and political considerations, markets are not an effective institution to deal with public goods because they are non-excludable, non-rival, and the transaction and operating costs of those markets would be enormous. It wouldn't be a well-functioning institution. Now, what I think is, if we agree on that, is it really capital the best frame to mobilize those ideas? If we think of other public goods, education, health, we do not really refer to them as capital, right?
Well, people do. I mean, they refer to social capital or intellectual capital. I mean, I have my reservations about that too, but people do use that language increasingly for almost everything. Some
people do, but I don't think, I would say people in this room maybe would think that, it's think primarily of care, education, health as capital. Yes, you can. But for me, it's a way of, why not use the word public good? There's an excellent paper. I think I saw Sophus in the audience before. There's an excellent paper that says, why don't we use more the language of public goods rather than calling these things capital? Calling them capital is a narrative that, for instance, put, financiers and so on as the sort of relevant actors. Why don't we think, for instance, that governments, public authorities, through public expenditures, can sustain these public goods, right?
Great. So, okay. Yeah, thank you. That's really, really clear. So on that point, and I'm going to ask you here to lean as much as possible as you can into Erik's concern about the use of good leaning, about the use of this frame, this language of capital and even monetary valuation, which is a very powerful, not only metaphor, but metric that brings us into the realm of economic value, which is also the same language used in financial value and seeking return. So leaning into that understanding of the concern, how do you respond to saying, but and yet still, or how do you understand that? I know you understand the concern. So holding that concern, how do you say, and yet still we can do this, and how can we prevent it from being taken and run away with a tool for those who exactly want to do that and marketize it?
Well, because I think you need different terms and different language to communicate with different audiences. And so these are not mutually exclusive things. There's not one right way to describe any of these complex things. So for some audiences, if you want to talk about public goods, that's fine, or the intrinsic rights of nature or value of nature, that's fine as well. But for other audiences, that's not going to carry much water. And the idea of, putting them in terms that people, that the audience can understand. And also that flips their mind around, because I think if you're talking about somebody who's, used to dealing with financial capital, and you say, oh, there's natural capital and there's social capital, and these are important as well, then it causes them to get out of their normal thought.
Doesn't it also say, they say, I know what to do with financial capital. I know to get a return on it. So if you show me natural capital, let me get my return on that now.
That's a possibility. But I think then they have to dig a little bit deeper and find out that that's not going to work with natural or social capital. You can't shoehorn it into a market system. So it forces them then to take the next step, which is, okay, well, these are community, these are public goods. These are things that have to be managed, in a different way. And yet they recognize that they're important. They can't ignore them any longer. And I think that's the step that you want to take. So I don't think you're necessarily buying into the neoliberal agenda. In fact, you're trying to subvert the neoliberal agenda, by talking about natural and social capital and these assets. And the whole idea of capital, I mean, this goes back to, systems analysis. The world is made up of stocks and flows, and we have to understand how the stocks and flows interact with each other. And what you call the stocks, you can call them capital or assets or beans or goods or services or whatever. But recognizing that we're all part of this complex interconnected system, I think is the next step that we want to take, because I don't think the neoliberal model has that view. It's like, this is the economy, this is the market, all we care about is that. And anything that gets in the way, we're going to try to ignore or subvert
right.
And so we want to make it clear that these other things they're not getting in the way. First of all, they're supporting what you're doing anyway. And second of all, we've got to look at the whole thing altogether.
So if I sit here as my policymaker with my accounts book again, I can really feel the pull of both of these, because on the one hand, you've given me, I was never thinking about the forests in my country. I was thinking about GDP. And now you've added this to and enriched my sense of my national accounts and changed some calculations I might make. And I've personally met some people who have been in the room with those policymakers and said, yeah, it made a difference that we had that on the table. They made a different decision. And yet at the same time, there's the risk that by putting everything in the language of capital and giving everything a monetary value, the economist kind of says, sorry, just hand me your calculations. I've now got everything here. I don't need any of you because I've got this, I've got your numbers, I've got my calculator, I'll put in the discount rate.
But if you say,
and I'll decide.
If you say,
But thanks, I've got your numbers, I don't need your argument, you see, because I've got your numbers. So it's just a calculation.
But if you say the forest is more valuable standing than it is if you cut it down for timber, then the question is, well, what do you do with that information? How do you use that? What does that mean? You can't cut it down for timber. You can't sell the timber. It's difficult to sell even the carbon credits, even though that's been tried. But because of all the constraints of making it into a sort of rival and excludable type good, which it's not. Then you have to be open to the argument, well, maybe there's other ways to manage these systems, as community assets rather than as private goods that go into a market. So it gets them out of the whole market mentality,
right?
If you do it properly. Now, I see the risk. It is a slippery slope, and some people can easily be misperceive what you're talking about.
Yes.
If you just say money, because they don't get the nuances of all the stuff we've been talking about here today. Mm-hmm. But I think that's our challenge, is to get beyond that first impression and really get them to understand some of the nuances so that they can take on board, I think, what we're both trying to say. That,
okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to open this up to the audience in a moment, but I'm going to invite Erik, if you just want to, again, leaning in with an appreciation of this space. How do you want to respond to what we've just been saying? And I'm sitting here as the minister or decision maker, and if you're not bringing me financial valuation of the forest that I'm thinking of turning into timber, what are you bringing me? How are you going to change my mind?
First of all, a clarification. I don't try to make the case that Bob or others using this approach are sort of buying into the neoliberal agenda. Not at all. my concern is the risk of how neoliberal agenda can abuse and sort of co-opt these type of framings and instruments. So I think that's an important clarification. Well, my problem, and I go back to the issue of utilitarianism as an overall framing. Yes, saying we should leave the forest standard because it has more value standing than when you cut it. It's a powerful line of argumentation, but it's also risky. Yes, maybe if you calculate the value of ecosystem services, you can convince decision makers to allow mangrove standing instead of converting them to shrimp farms, to cite a classical example. But can ecosystems compete with real estate, with mining, with coca plantations? If we buy into the type of logic that nature must be profitable or that must give more benefits than cost to justify its existence, I think we're going in a very slippery way. What if it happened not to be profitable to conserve nature? We run out of arguments for protecting nature. 10 years ago, ecological economists like Bob, myself, were preaching in the wilderness about incommensurability of values, multiple values of nature. Things have been changing quickly. And now IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, just a few months ago, released a report saying one of the main drivers of nature destruction is that we're having too short-term thinking, based on a narrow set of market-oriented values. And this is signed by around 150 governments. So it's no longer a sort of strange, academic sect making the case, no? So I think this is fundamentally important, the pedagogy we need here. I mean, when we have cathedrals around, we don't make cost-benefit analysis regularly to justify their existence, right? We have accepted as a society that it has other values, spiritual values, aesthetic values that justifies its existence. I think the same type of pedagogy is needed when it comes to nature. We have to acknowledge a diversity of fundamentally important values in nature, and we need to rethink the different weights we're giving to these values. If a politician only understands the money language, maybe rather than using that language, we have to change that politician.
Great, powerful points. Okay, I'd like to open up the room, and before we do that, I want to recognize that the three of us sitting here are white global northerners, right? Speaking about ecosystem values that are actually relevant to the whole world.
Where are you from originally?
Spanish Norwegian hybrid.
Okay.
I'll count that in.
Okay.
But we all lived in Europe, the global north, and North America. So I just want to acknowledge that we are speaking about valuation of ecosystems of the entire planet. So if there's anybody in this room who wants to bring a voice that is not currently represented on this stage, if you want to speak for nature, if you want to speak for a different cultural, indigenous, or a totally other worldview, I very strongly welcome you to raise your hand and to bring that voice. So I'm also going to acknowledge there's not a lot of time, in which case I ask the questions to be short, if you can, concise, but also curious, okay? This is about bringing out the curiosity and interest and leaning in and listening and learning rather than confronting and challenging, because this is a rare opportunity to do so. Yes, please.
I would like to this. Hello, everyone. So when it comes to the commodification of nature, we've heard the benefits and the cons of it as well. But when it comes to global South communities that are wanting to focus on green growth, which is very controversial, what do you say to them? Like, how do you create those value systems for them that aren't just cultural or social, and try to create, I'd say, equitable markets that exist for them without too much corporate intervention, so that they can actually scale up their economies and focus on well-being as well as their own development?
Can I answer that?
You can, please, you need to speak that. Please try to speak concisely so we've got time for some more questions.
I think the problem is that all around the world, we are addicted to this growth metaphor.
Just Bob's new book, Addicted to Growth, Societal Therapy for a Sustainable Wellbeing Future. A wonderful new book just out.
And the And a big step in the therapy is how do we envision the kind of world that we want, one that's based on well-being rather than simply growth in the material economy. And I think that needs to drive all of our development policies, north and south, and east and west, and up and down. But and I think it can make a big difference, because I think part of the problem is, this developing countries are trying to replicate all the mistakes that the developed countries made during their development, and that's not what we want. So it's going to take some changes all around, but I think there is a common goal that we can identify, and I think that's what's needed to move things in the right direction.
Thanks. Erik, speak to that.
I think Bob gave a very good comprehensive answer to that question.
Great. Hey, we agree. Okay, I'm going to stand up. Anybody? Yes, the lady right at the back.
Thank you. I'm not sure if this is a question, and I will try to keep it short, but a lot of what we're talking about has connotations on development of nations that are emerging and growing right now, right? So we have the IFCs and the World Banks telling us you need to be growing. So we're growing for a few decades. Then they say, come, you should be green. So we're green and we're growing. And then the thing that you're talking about preserving nature and looking at it as something that's a part of us inherently, well, a lot of our cultures actually have that, but we were stripped of that to participate in neoliberal capitalism. But now we're, being told, oh no, go back to that. And I think all I'm trying to say is that can create a lot of confusion for countries that are not just growing economically, but also growing in populations. They are losing jobs. We are losing out on our economy because of climate change right now. And I guess what I'm asking is, how do we come together to come up with a narrative that is future facing and doesn't quickly change? I will read your book. Thank you.
It's a very big question, so it's difficult to provide a good answer. I think it's, here I think Bob and myself are very much on along the same lines. There are a whole range of arguments about growth that do no longer hold true. I think that the narrative we're trying to mobilize here is one that takes attention out of growth and puts it into well-being, right? And I think this has origins in utilitarian thinking. Again, this idea, we want to maximize happiness for society. We do that by expanding utility. This we do by creating wealth. Growth is the best machinery to create wealth. And that is true, that applies to some stages maybe of the economic development. But we also know that after certain levels of income, perceptions of happiness and economic growth start departing from each other, right? And I think in the end, the problem we have here is that we know that if we keep growing continually, we're destroying the ability of ecological life support system to sustain economies in the long term. And of course, some parts of the world still needs to grow. For these parts of the world, growth can be essential until you cover a set of basic needs. But we're in parts of the world where maybe growth is no longer increasing so much our well-being. And actually by growing, we're engaging in neo-colonial practices to which we are appropriating disproportionate amounts of our shrinking carbon budgets, resource budgets, and so on. So if we want to make space for other parts of the world to keep expanding until they can cover their basic needs, some parts of the world will start to start shrinking. So donut economics 1.0.
And also we're at risk of moving into a growth-degrowth debate, which is interesting that wants to pop up. I'm going to ask, does anybody have experience of being involved in a policy process that did or didn't use ecosystem valuation? Anybody want to bring from a project or a policy that you've been involved in? I'm not seeing any hands going up. That's interesting. Okay. Yes, a hand. Would you like to just speak to that? And
in Ireland, we rolled out an all-Ireland pollinator action plan, which had a lot of buy-in from farmers, and there was no interest from farmers or from the Department of Agriculture in preserving pollinators until we started publishing papers on the monetary valuation of pollinators on oilseed rape, particularly in Ireland. And so in Ireland, we haven't had any success in preserving insect biodiversity on farms until we engaged with the natural capital framework.
That's
So-
a really interesting example. So can we just clarify? You're not saying that the farmers were paid to do something differently in order to protect pollinators. You're saying that by
Just by
publishing the
pointing
valuation, the value that's actually held by the pollination services provided by those insects, that information changed farmers' attitudes. Is that, am I correct? in what you're saying?
After that, then we got to have meetings with the Department of Agriculture, and they facilitated the rollout of this All Ireland Pollinator Plan. And I think there was like some money put towards preserving floral strips on the sides of farms and hedgerows and things like that. So
Okay.
it was more from the Department of Agriculture, and they had no interest in meeting us until
Okay.
we started putting things in monetary terms.
Thank you for putting it. So this is the kind of the policymakers' book on the table, and what I'm hearing in this example where, because it was expressed, it was heard, it got into the room, and then the policy was made different. Eric, does that, how, I mean, I'm sure it's not the first time you've heard such an example, but how do you think when you hear an example that actually this did make a difference, this did work?
Well, it gives me hope. The thing is that somehow I sometimes have the feeling that when people say, well, if you don't do monetary valuation, then you do what? I have the feeling you're sort of pushing the burden of truth, to those who makes a case for alternatives. But honestly, yes, we have some success stories. We tell many times about, Catskill watershed in New York, how, investing in ecological restoration avoided costs in terms of having to build new water purification plants. I think this is an interesting use of money metrics. You are looking at real costs you would incur if you had to replace ecosystem functions through built capital. But we don't have so many cases. I mean, this is a discourse we have mobilized for the last 25 years, and I can't see we have managed to reverse. One could argue it's because we did not push hard enough. But honestly, I don't see proof that since the time we have started to mobilize this type of discourses, we have seen major changes in terms of reversing the ecological crisis. That there are concrete success stories, of course, yes, but are there enough?
I think there are a lot of success stories along those lines. I'm thinking of China as well, and also the Great Green Wall in Africa. And the last slide I put up, about the decade of ecosystem restoration, UN, program is now saying we have to restore all of these ecosystems, and it's partly driven by, the information that we've been putting out in terms of the value of these systems in monetary terms or not. And let me stress again that I don't think these are mutually exclusive ways of framing the issue. You've got to communicate with the audience that you're trying to communicate with. And the best language to use is often something that evolves over time. But, in China, they've invested literally billions of dollars in reforesting, some of the Loess Plateau and reducing sort of sandstorms in Beijing. And, I think they're doing an amazing job. And part of that is driven by the information I think that we've provided on the value of these services. They have a whole program now of calculating the gross ecosystem product of the country, every year, and as a way of adding that to their national accounts, but in a very different way than the SIA program is doing.
Okay.
So
We have 5 more minutes, so I really want to ask each of you, what would it take to change your mind? What would you need to see happening in the world that you probably don't want to see happening? What would make you think actually this is going to be turned into commodification? They are always going to think the monetary valuation is a price. What would make you change your mind, Bob?
What would make me change my mind and think that it's
Actually, you know what? I'm going to say we need to move away from this, or I need to really speak out against this very clearly, or I regret the way this has come to be used.
I guess there are some initiatives that are talking about, okay, we should market the markets for ecosystem services people. And I think those have been around for a while. We need to create markets for ecosystem services. I don't think it's working. I don't think it ever will work because I don't think ecosystem services fit into that market model. But, you know, they've tried to shoehorn other things into that market model, you know, with disastrous results, like the intellectual commons as well. And so, you know, I think that if that were successful, you know, and they managed to say, okay, we're now privatizing the entire planet, all ecosystem services are going to be, you know, sold in markets. Yeah, then I'd say, oops. But
Great. That's great. So if
but I
that's
don't think that will ever happen.
okay,
for
and
the
what's the
reasons I
best
claimed.
thing that can be done by yourself, by any of us, or any researcher looking to make a difference? What's the best thing that can be done to make sure that that doesn't happen?
I think explaining the distinction between valuation and privatization and the need for different property rights regimes, you know, the understanding of how do we manage and protect public goods, natural capital, social capital, whatever you want to call them. You know, I think that's the real agenda going forward. The atmosphere being one of the major ones that we're struggling with at the moment. And so how do we protect that asset for current and future generations? And, you know, understanding how to value it and also how to use economic incentives more effectively, because I don't think what we're doing now is working quickly enough anyway. So I think we could do a much better job of, you know, claiming ownership of the atmosphere and saying, if you damage our asset, it belongs to all of us, you got to pay for those damages. And we use those funds to try to reverse the damages and prevent future damages from occurring. We're not doing that now. You know, all of the cops are, you know, they're waving their hands around, but not much is happening.
Right.
And it's got to happen more quickly.
Great.
So.
Thank you. Thank you for being so open about and reflective about that. I want to ask you the same, Erik, rather than to respond to that, but what would it take for you to change your mind, whether we say actually it is okay to identify ecosystem services of value to humanity? It is okay to even give them a monetary valuation. What would you need to what would you need to see happening in the world? Or an alternative, and I understand you saying, like, you know, it's too much to put the onus of proof on those, say, then what? And yet we do need to find alternatives. If this isn't a good one, we, you know, to be propositional is a very powerful form of protest. So would we need to see the rights of nature actually getting caught up in courtrooms and turned into another legal tool for corporations to capture? What would it take for you to say, actually, maybe this is the best of the worst set of policies available?
Well, maybe a couple of points. The first one, if I could see they're very effective at transforming, I would be more positive to them. I don't know, I can put an example, like positive discrimination is something that at the outset doesn't appeal to my egalitarian values. But when I've seen the role it has played and how effective they've been in Nordic countries in closing gender gaps, I say, okay, if it works, let's go for it, right? I'm not yet convinced that monetary valuation is managing to drive or this pragmatism. I think it's still to be demonstrated that it's giving those results. The other one is that I think there's of course room to play with money and payments, but I'm pessimistic about the role they would play within the existing institutional setup. So if we get political transformation where the role of markets and private property is reduced in our governance systems, and this may sound utopian, but I believe it can be changed and that they will be changed at some point, where we have markets more effectively embedded in social institutions, defining the limits of money and markets, I think it would be a more useful tool. I recommend everyone, I always tell my students, we all should read this book by William Capp, The Social Cost of Business Enterprise. It says all these costs on nature are not accidental externalities, they are cost shifting. There are ways through which we can increase our profit margins by imposing costs on others. So when indigenous communities have been suing Chevron Texaco in courts for oil spills, and judges have forced them to pay for these costs and to internalize these costs, I think this is, for instance, a use of economic valuation that can be aligned with principles of environmental justice, for instance.
Great, thank you. So we are at time, and I'm going to just ask both Bob and Erik to invite you to a reflection. So rather than make a final point for my position, to offer a question or a thought to the audience that you want people here and online to take away, and a question you want them to keep asking themselves so that they come up with their own better view on this and can change their mind. Do you want to go, Bob? Just a thought or a reflection or something that you keep coming back to that you think helps make the case for the view that you hold.
Why haven't we solved this problem more quickly? Why are we still stuck?
Great. Why are we still stuck? Why haven't we solved this? Thank you. That was super concise. You did just very well. Erik.
So 5 words, you get 5.
Are you counting again? Metrics.
Yeah.
How has private property become such a sacred institution, and how have we lost our hope to believe in our ability to change it?
Take that, audience. Could you please all join to thank both Erik and Bob for being so open to leaning into and listening and to so respectfully disagreeing. May there be more conversations like this in the world. Thank you very much.